I love nature. I love how expressive, subtle, and alien it all is. I think sometimes because we're so conditioned by our repeated exposure to it, we can lose sight of how weird and mysterious it all is. Nature also has this quality of perfection to it. It doesn't demand to be any way other than itself. It flows, it goes completely without resistance or effort. It's very pure, spontaneous, and unapologetic in its expression. And it's not just some random chaotic mess either. There's an intelligence, a precision, an order to it. Nature is somehow able to express a beauty and authenticity without any self-interference. There's no inner critic or judgment to nature telling it how it should be one way or another. Again, it just flows. For me, the more time I spend in nature, the more I feel it has to teach, particularly within the domain of spirituality and particularly within the domain of surrender. What's interesting is that there's no way for nature to let go or surrender. There's no way it could resist spontaneity or get in the way of itself through clinging and attachment. And I believe when we observe nature long enough, there are some profound lessons there to consider and contemplate on. In this video, I'd like to address the art and practice of letting go, why it's so important on the spiritual path, and how as we practice letting go over and over in meditation and with living life, the act itself becomes more of a play and an art form rather than something to do or not do. I hope you enjoy. Surrender and spirituality is sort of like a buzzword in the community. There's a lot of people that talk about why surrender is important, why we should let go of our attachments, our clinging, our aversion, why surrendering these things and giving them away, basically, letting them go, is very important on the spiritual path. And I think oftentimes we can lose sight of its true significance. And we can also lose sight of its nuance, because on the one hand, you have spiritual teachers that talk about the fact that there's nothing to surrender. That when we consider the fact that all is one, that we are all at the very bottom level, bedrock level of reality, we are all one, we are all unified, from the perspective that the universe is just one whole, one holistic thing, and that there's no such thing as separation. All separation and like objective distinction is falsehood. When we consider that perspective, it makes sense that surrender would be an illusion, so to speak, that there's no way to surrender. And what's interesting is that we can actually practice this level, this view of reality. We can act from a space, an orientation that surrendering is impossible. So it's sometimes useful when we're trying to surrender. Let's say we are feeling suffering, we're feeling caught in illusion, we're feeling caught in ignorance, and we're very much feeling like a separate entity. It's sometimes very effective to at least intellectually fall back on the understanding that it's impossible for reality to surrender. So like from a very, very honest point of view, there's no way for something that's complete and perfect and whole to let go. Reality in the universe is already accepting itself. And so you, by extension, are already accepting yourself. Your true nature from this point of view is total self-acceptance. And the idea that there's anything to surrender, that there's anything wrong and something to surrender at all, is already taking a step in the wrong direction. Sometimes viewing reality through this lens is very effective at freeing us up from whatever mind concept trap that we have found ourselves within. But equally, from another point of view, this is also bullshit. Because if we are caught in suffering, if we're feeling like we are just stuck in Maya, an illusion, trying to fall back and pretend that we feel free, that we feel the truth of surrender when we don't, is just a form of spiritual bypassing or even psychological bypassing. So it's really important that when we understand the significance of letting go, when we understand that letting go of attachments and clinging and aversion is the key to freedom, that we also are honest with ourselves with where we're at. And to just dismiss the act of letting go, like the volitional, intentional act of letting go of an attachment or letting go of a desire in the moment, to dismiss the power, the freeing power of this act of letting go, I think would be to misunderstand the true nature of surrender and to misunderstand the true nature of reality. Because the thing is reality is this very, very paradoxical beast. So again, on the one hand, it's true. It's totally true that there's nothing that's whole and complete and perfect to surrender. There's no way that if the self is this perfect entity, if you at your core are self-acceptance, there's no way for you to surrender. But equally, we can take on the perspective that there is such a thing as surrender. And so to only orient ourselves in one of these positions, I think would be to misunderstand the very, very deep relative nature of reality. The relative nature of reality insofar as we can look at reality in an infinite number of ways. Depending on what we are trying to orient towards, if we're trying to orient towards enlightenment, we might need an act of volition, an intentional act of surrender, or we might need to realize that there's no such thing as even the possibility of letting go. And so when we consider this system or this way of showing up in the world, surrendering, letting go of, like I said, attachments and clinging, we have to recognize that it's an art form, it's a play. And the suffering that is created by attachment, it isn't always a simple thing to free ourselves from. Sometimes it very much does take an intentional act of just letting go, like Sedona method style. If you guys haven't looked into the Sedona method, I would highly recommend it. It's a good technique for this letting go. But sometimes it's also really important to just realize, like, hey, if things are perfect as they are, if that's like the deepest spiritual truth in this universe, that we're already whole and complete just the way that we are, then there's no need to change anything about our experience at all. And from a certain point of view, that is what spirituality is all about, right? It's like things are perfect, and our resistance to certain experiences, even our resistance to suffering itself, is the propagation of more suffering. And this art of surrender, this art of letting go, is a balancing act between these two broad perspectives. At least it's been that way in my life. And I think the more that we can play and be comfortable in this paradox, the more that we can embody both of them simultaneously, or perhaps neither of them while also embodying them, the more that we can work and play in paradox, particularly within the domain of surrender, the more powerful that this will become over time. And the last thing that I would like to talk about is just going over the journey, like, of what and where surrender leads to. I mean, let's just take a step back. Where does this whole surrender business really lead? Well, I personally always relate it back to one of the unifying qualities connecting all of us, and for that matter, connecting all sentient beings, and that is death. The fact that this will all end. It's something that isn't really talked about or acknowledged in our culture, the fact that all of this will be over. And so the more that we are able to release and surrender in our lives to the flow and forces of impermanent existence, to the lack of expectation being met, the more at peace we will be in both life and as we pass through the veil of death. One of my favorite poems is called The Mind of Absolute Trust. And the first few lines go straight to the heart of surrender, in my opinion. And I think that when we can embody that, we can face death boldly. We can face death with fulfillment and happiness on our side. In one way or another, whether in life or at the moment of death, we will surrender everything. In one way or another, we will all completely let go. And I believe the more that we can embody this truth, the more at peace and harmony life will be lived. The more deeply we let go, the more deeply we will act from a place of authenticity, passion, and our deepest desires. And ultimately, the more deeply that we surrender, the more deeply we will know who we are.